Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Rabia of Basra, also known as Rabia al-Adawiyya. She was a saint and a poet in the Sufi tradition of Islam, which is to say that she was a mystic. She is an extremely fascinating historical figure with a rich history and a rich body of work. Let's get started. Rabia was born around 717 CE in modern-day Iraq and died around 801 in the same place. Growing up, her family was quite poor. When famine hit during Rabia's childhood, her family starved, killing both of her parents. After this tragic turn of events, Rabia was sold into slavery for 6 dirhams, which was an egregiously small amount of money. These laborious years of slavery were tempered by a deepening faith within Rabia. During the day she would toil, and at night she would pray, often while weeping and prostrating. Notably, these prayers were not formulaic. Rather, they were deeply personal, conversational, even. It is said that one night, while Rabia was alone praying in a barn, her master heard her praying something along the lines of, "All I want is to serve you, O God, but I am made to serve another man. What shall I do?" Upon hearing this, her master was deeply moved and freed her. After she was freed, she lived for a while amongst the Bedouins, nomadic folk. Eventually, she found her way back to Basra, where she lived the rest of her life in forced poverty according to the precepts of Sufism, a mystical strain within Islam which did not really take off until several hundred years after Rabia's death. An understanding of Sufism, however brief, is crucial in order to understand Rabia. As I said, this devotion was ascetic. Poverty was encouraged as a means to free up time and energy for the worship and contemplation of God. A common way for Sufis to express their internal contemplative state was through poetry and elaborate extemporaneous prayers. A fine example of Sufi poetry and prayer lies in the works of the Persian mystic Jalal ad-Din Muhammad Rumi, or Rumi for short. His poetry has been made popular in the past 20 years or so, largely due to the scholarship of Coleman Barks at the University of Georgia. Now, Coleman Barks does not speak or read Persian. His translations are kind of interpretive, they're not really translations. If you want to talk about it with me later, you can talk about it. It's a little irksome to me, whatever. So, according to some, though, Rumi is the most widely read poet in America because of these translations, or whatever you call them. Sufis such as Rumi are known for their often ecstatic modes of religious expression, which oftentimes express themselves through poetry, although not always. Not all of this expression can be pigeonholed as quote unquote emotional. Rabia's works, for instance, often show great restraint, and it is worth mentioning that she was respected as a scholar and a teacher in her time. Rabia's own intellectual formation was derived from the life and works of a man named Hassan al-Basri, an early Muslim mystic and preacher, born in Medina only 10 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death. From him, or at least by his influence, she became a figure which bridged the emotionality of mysticism with the rigor of intellectualism. One quote from Rabia exemplifies her restrained attitude, which is nevertheless a result of her deep feeling towards God, right? It goes, "I am a servant, and what business does a servant have with desire? If I reach for something, and my Lord does not, that is infidelity." Clearly, she held herself back a lot, but she did so in order to experience, at least from her point of view, God more fully. Her experience of, or rather, her experience with, God was so deep, so intimate, that she referred to God as her friend, or even her beloved. As such, she was celibate, despite being proposed to by scholars, prominent Sufis, and even the ruler of Basra himself. She was not strictly speaking against the institution of marriage, but as she saw it, she had bigger things to deal with. The most important thread in her work are these bigger things to deal with, this grappling with God and with the afterlife. This can be seen in her most famous poem, or what is perhaps her most famous poem. It goes like this: "If I adore you out of fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I adore you out of desire for paradise, lock me out of paradise. But if I adore you for yourself alone, do not deny to me your eternal beauty." So there's a lot of this, a lot of intellectual wanting to know about God, but in a very emotional, extreme way. This doesn't delve into physicality very often, and it's often in the mind, but it's still very extreme. Um, it's clear from that poem that we just read that her devotion to God was absolute and all encompassing. What's less clear is why she renounced her worldly beliefs, all of them, for God. Some modern scholars have put a feminist spin on this, framing this renunciation as an act against the human patriarchy. In other words, if she gave herself to God, she would not be subject to the whims of men. Such interpretations of Rabia's life and work arose in the wake of Margaret Smith's 1928 biography, which compared Rabia to mystics in the Christian world, creating an affinity between West and East in their respective modes of religious expression. This did a lot for Rabia's legacy. It really opened her up to a world which had not experienced her poetry before, and there's actually a lot of commonality, as Margaret Smith proves. Sources before Margaret Smith's biography were Sufi hagiographies written in Arabic which emphasized miracles attributed to Rabia, as well as many of her prayers. These are of vital importance, especially because they constitute the only written record of Rabia's work. She kept none herself. It's important to keep this in mind when analyzing Rabia's work, as well as the work of many women writers we have encountered thus far in the semester. As a saintly figure, and as one without a voice of her own that survives into the present, she is subject to having ideas projected onto her by the men who wrote her hagiographies, which are the only things that survive. Let's remember that. In this sense, her legacy mirrors that of Olata Petros, the 17th century Ethiopian saint that Summer Ann gave her presentation on last week. Similarly, Wolata's legacy survives to us mainly through hagiography. Her emotional, exclusive relationship with God also evokes that of somebody else, Hindaya al Ujami, who Elena gave her presentation on last week also. Um, Now, Rabia's relationship with God was less extreme, perhaps, than Hindaya's. I think they had a lot of differences in circumstances. Um, Rabia's emphasis on God was definitely less physical than Hindaya's, but I think the comparison is especially apt because of the worlds they both found themselves in. Despite living nearly a century apart, they both started out or remained cosmopolitan figures in the Arab world, with many patrons and admirers, respectively. Rabia, though, never isolated herself completely from society. I like to think she rather thrived off of the intellectual energy of the port town of Basra, which was so vibrant towards the end of the 1st century CE. To me, she also brings to mind Gillian of Norwich, whose relationship with God is a little more physical along the lines of Hindaya, but it's also very metaphysical, like Rabia. I think the more apt comparison to make, though, is with Hildegard. Both Rabia and Hildegard were huge intellectual forces. That can't be stressed enough. Unfortunately, most of Rabia's work doesn't really survive because she didn't write it down. Hildegard, as we know, had a scribe. But it's important to compare these two figures and to really claim a lot of the work that Rabia did as being similar to figures like Hildegard in the West. Here are some sources that I did come upon. I hope that you all take a little bit of a look at them because Rabia is just such a fascinating figure. Although she didn't write any of these herself, these really contextualize her life and give some idea of what she was like and the things that she said. I hope that after this presentation and after looking at these sources, you will find her just as rich, just as insightful of a figure as I do. Thanks very much.